Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I'm here with another 6x6 paper pad tutorial, this time featuring P13, the Four Seasons Winter Collection, and I'm also going to be using some colored cardstock from scrapbook.com just to mix things up and because I wanted to give their cardstock a try. This was actually one of my favorite P13 pads when I first discovered the company, but it was out of stock at the time. And at the time I'm recording this, it's still currently out of stock, or once again out of stock at scrapbook.com, but I will try to link you to a couple sources. And if it is out of stock, you can always get notified. I think that because this is a very winter themed paper pad, if you aren't able to get it and create cards in time for Christmas, you actually could create a lot of cards that would be great after Christmas. And a lot of or create ahead for next year, because I like to do Christmas crafting around Christmas time, but you want to make sure your cards are getting to your recipients early enough. When you're sending to friends and family, being there right before Christmas is fine, but I actually do like to send a couple weeks ahead of time so they can incorporate the cards into their Christmas decor, and I personally like to do that as well, so I like when cards arrive early. Anyway, P13 pads. The inside, front, and back cover do include some images that you can cut out. You could fussy cut them, or you can use a machine like the Scan and Cut. I don't have any other machine. I just have the Scan and Cut, so I'm going to show you a little bit about how I do that. But I think that that's a really good... Well, I like things that don't include a lot of waste. Part of my purpose in my channel overall is to encourage you to use your craft supplies and really use them up when you can, in the way of having fun with it, not just using them up to use them up. But I really always want to show you how you can get good value for the supplies and, make things without scrap so that you can really enjoy all those crafting products that you get. And having these die cut images on the front and back cover, I don't mind recycling the front and back of pads. I do all the time, but it's just an added bonus value to me for these paper pads. And it gives you something like images to work with in the cards without having to buy a coordinating coordinating stamp set. This paper pad, the die cut images, had a lot of white in them. And last time I struggled a little bit with the white images, the Scan and Cut struggle, because the Scan and Cut is looking for color or black to help determine what the image is. So when it's a really, really light color, like some of these whites are, it is very hard for the Scan and Cut to see. I am going to attempt to add some more lines to the edge of these white images with a pencil. I have mixed success, and that's because in part, I think I was going too light with my lines. I would recommend drawing the darker lines if you're trying to use a Scan and Cut. Definitely use a pencil because you want to be able to erase it afterwards, but maybe don't use your lightest pressure of the pencil. Be a little bit more bold. If the lines don't erase all of the way at the end and you don't like it, that's a bummer, but at the same time, the other option may have been that it didn't cut at all or it cut funny, and then you still wouldn't have the die cut. So in the future, I think I will err on the side of making a darker, heavier line, but in general, I had more success, and I think I was able to save a few die cuts by tracing around the edges of them. I think if I hadn't done that, they would not have cut out as well. The only other small issue that I did find was that the Scan and Cut could not recognize the cookie inside of the wreath. Once it saw the wreath as the image, it didn't really look for anything on the inside, which makes sense because, if you were die cutting like any of the things, you wouldn't want it to cut the berries off of the leaves. Once it's determined the leaves are the edges on the one in the bottom left there, you want it to stop. So it kind of does the same thing with the wreath. And therefore, what you could do is take your scissor and kind of just die cut out that single, or not die cut, but fussy cut out that single one if you really wanted to preserve them. I actually didn't once done creating ever find a particular card that I really wanted to use the wreath or the cookies for. So I don't actually do anything with them in the end. You can attach them to the inside of cards, which is what I would do in the end. But I wanted to point that out because that is another sort of flaw of the Scan and Cut, is that if images are inside of each other, it's not going to be able to recognize them. As you can see here, there were a couple images where there was a lot of white that it was not able to cut them perfectly. So there even are a few images that I did use on my cards that weren't cut perfectly because I'm not worried about everything being perfect, but like there I had to discard. There's a little pretzel with some icing on it, and I had to discard that because it did not recognize the edges of the white icing. Here though, because I was adding those pencil lines, it did cut this flower. And so I'm going to go through and I'm going to erase my pencil lines. And I was overall pretty happy with the results. I'm just showing you a few here so you can see what it looks like when the Scan and Cut cuts them. The Scan and Cut is designed to cut with colored images. If you want a little more detail, you could check out the other P13 video. I go into a bit more about how to do it and like what cut speeds and stuff to use in that video. But you do want to be scanning with color, not black and white, because then, of course, the black and white is going to be looking for the black edges. This present was probably the most prominent example of how it was confusing for the Scan and Cut because it is seeing those really bold red lines. And so if you don't make the outer lines strong enough to compete with that, that's what's going to think is the edge. Just briefly again, the Cocoa Cup, it did cut something off of it, but it wasn't really noticeable. Like you don't know that it's missing if you don't know what it's supposed to look like. So the fact that it cut off like, I think the straw or a cinnamon stick or something, it didn't particularly matter. There's also one or two instances where it cut a little bit wonky and I was able to trim it myself with scissors. But overall, I was happy to not have to fussy cut all of that. One more thing I want to share with you in terms of my process before I just get into the making of the cards. I had previously shared a Taylor Expressions stamp set where you stamp a whole bunch of sentiments at one time. Then you take a die cut and it die cuts all of those sentiments at one time. The one that appealed to me was their mini one, and it cuts rectangles only. I think there is a die version of it that cuts like slants on the side, but I wanted an option of something that was a little bit like fancier because this paper pad with all the florals and stuff to me reads as more of like a fancy look. So I found this stamp set from LDRS Creative and a coordinating die set. It does the same thing. It stamps a whole bunch of sentiments. You line up some, I think they're squares on the side, or maybe they're circles. I think they're circles. You line up the circles with the die, which I'll show you, and then it just die cuts all of those sentiments out at once. And this was a Christmas themed one. It does leave a lot of room at the edges of some of the sentiments, which might not be your preferred look, but I just thought that the wavy banners was a, more elegant and a different look than the Tailored Expression stamp set. I would certainly recommend you just get whichever one. Well, get what you like, if you want to have a whole bunch of I think I'm going to use I know I'm going to use the Tailored Expressions and I'm going to use the LDRS. But they both have a Christmas stamp. They both have a harvest stamp. So if, you feel like you only have the funds or the budget for one of them, I think that you could just pick whether you have generally tend to make more elegant cards or more simple cutesy cards. And simple cutesy is more my thing. That's why I was really drawn to the simple rectangles the first time. But here you see I'm lining up the die and making sure the circles at the edge of the die match up with the circles in the die itself, or the circles that are stamped onto the paper. And then I have a whole bunch of sentiments cut out. The scrapbook.com cardstock collection included 5 of each sheet. With that in mind, I knew I was probably only going to make 4 of each card because there's 4 of each paper. But I actually cut 5 of the sentiment. I picked the light blue because I felt like that was one of the most prominent colors in the collection, that almost every paper had blue in it, particularly a light blue. So I just used all 5 of those. And there was one, when I stamped it down, a little hair or something got in the way and made an imperfect impression of 2 sentiments. what's nice is, when I'm stamping like 10 sentiments, if 2 get ruined, I still have a lot from that, from the stamping that are still good. I haven't wasted the whole thing, but that was something that one of the reasons that the fact that I had 5 and I, wasn't like only had exactly enough worked out for me. So the scrapbook.com cardstock pad. I don't usually keep a lot of colored cardstock on hand. And that's mostly because I find that you can pick out a blue cardstock that you think is really pretty, but then maybe it doesn't match up with this particular collection. So then you need to keep a couple of colors on hand. And that takes up a lot of storage, like even a couple of different kinds of blue. It takes up a lot of storage room. But I do like the look of matting, and I think it's really great, particularly with this style of paper pad. I think with the more elegant style of paper pad, it works out really well. And I think because this paper collection has so much white, if you were to place these mostly white patterns on more mostly white patterns, everything would get lost, and it really needed some color. So I decided that I wanted to purchase some cardstock to go with the collection. And I thought this scrapbook.com paper or cardstock pad would be perfect because the colors seemed to generally match up with the colors of the collection. And I thought, well, there's not a ton of it, so I bet I would wind up using it all while using up this paper pad. And actually that wound up being true, in part because I was trying to, probably, but most of it happened pretty naturally, and I was really happy to have these cardstock options for the background. I like being able to get a small amount of cardstock. I like that it's perfectly the size of a card base, so you don't have a lot of extra. If you do prefer to have it just smaller than a card base, you will be trimming off little bits at the edge. That would happen even if you were using 8.5 by 11 paper. I like that the color palette is, kind of concise and chosen for you, and they all go pretty well together. Overall, there was a lot of pluses to this cardstock. But in the interest of always being honest, and you guys, I think that most of you are aware, I have affiliate links in my video descriptions always. That is one of the ways that YouTubers are able to make money from their channel without costing you anything, without charging you for videos, because when you make a purchase, we get a small percentage. I'm a scrapbook.com affiliate. I enjoy many of their products, but this particular cardstock, I just want to let you know, is not very thick. It is certainly not as thick as the 110-pound cardstock that I usually work with. You can see here I'm getting lots of little strips from trying to mat things. That's okay. I'm going to show you how I'm going to use some of those later in the video and some ideas for those. So this cardstock is the cardstock from the cardstock pack is actually not any thicker than the paper that I'm working with. I, in fact, I really wouldn't even consider it cardstock. I would consider it paper in terms of its thickness. It reminds me of really good pattern paper. Not all pattern paper is as thick as that, but most of the top brands. So like if you think of pretty much any like Lawn Fawn, Doodlebug, trying to think of like other like MFT paper is probably thinner. So yeah, just to give you an idea, it's about as thick as any pattern paper would be. Another slight challenge, which actually overall I'm fine with, it's just a style choice. Like I tend to go a 1/4 inch bigger with my mats rather than any smaller than that, just because the measurements are a little easier to go in 1/4 of an inch versus 1/8 of an inch. However, if I have a 2x2 piece of paper and then I take this cardstock pack, it's perfectly the size of a card base, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I can't mat 2 pieces of 2-inch cardstock on it with a 1/4 inch, because then you would need a 1/4 inch more than 2 twice. So you would need 4.5, and this is only 4.25. With that in mind, sometimes I chose to go with a thinner 1/8 of an inch mat instead of a 1/4 of an inch mat. So it's going to make oh, I don't think I even mentioned this yet. Here we are 15 minutes into the video, and I bet most of you will be happy to know there's a coordinating blog post. You don't have to try to pay attention to like every little thing I'm doing. I'm obviously not even telling you exactly what I'm doing. I'm just generally talking about the process because I think that based on comments, that is what people find most helpful. And that all of the if you want to know how you're supposed to be making these cards, that, because that's obviously what I'm doing on camera. And maybe some of you thought that's what I would be explaining. Like, oh, I'm cutting this at this. I put all of those measurements on my blog. So if you want to know how to recreate a specific card from the video or all of the cards from the video, go over to the blog and I will tell you the measurement of every single piece of paper on every single card. And I am making 44 cards, but there are 11 designs over on my blog and 11 designs I will show you in the video, and then I make 4 of each because there's 4 of each paper. So hopefully I've given you the rundown that I probably should have given you 10 minutes ago when this video started, or well, technically 15 minutes ago, but anyway. So you're going to see 1/4 inch mats, you're going to see 1/8 inch mats. You're going to see like 7 costume changes. Well, costume, but you know what I mean. Wardrobe changes as I go throughout this video because it was recorded over many, many days. Like designing this many cards when you only sometimes have like maybe an hour in your craft room can be like cutting all this cardstock. That is one of the reasons I hesitate to use mats. Like I hesitate to put all my paper on mats and like, because then you have to do twice the amount of cutting and it makes it much more time consuming. But the other way that I save time, because as I mentioned, I can't always be in my craft room all day, every day, like we would love to be. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to be sometimes. Although, of course, I actually, I totally enjoy spending time with family and going out in nature and all that. But, there's some days where you're like, oh, I just wish I could just craft all day, right? We can't. So what I do, and I've mentioned this many times before, is once I've cut all of the pieces, and again, in this case, since I'm making 4 of each card, there's going to be a lot of pieces, and gluing all those pieces together is going to take some time. So I take all of the pre-cut pieces and I put them in a Ziploc bag together, or zip top bag. And I use the ones that I use to store my stamp sets just because I have them on hand and they're really, really thick, so I can use them like a million times and they won't rip, which is why I like to store my stamp sets in them. And so then once all the pieces are away in those bags, I can then assemble them at a later time. Now, a question I get asked a lot is, well, do you ever forget what the card was supposed to look like? Not very often. And if I do, I have this video to reference. This is actually the card that I forgot what I did because it's like so outside of my wheelhouse. Normally I have like one piece of big paper at least to ground everything. But here I wound up using like the small rectangle and the 2 little squares. The reason is because I'm always trying to use my scrap. So that rectangle that's off to the side was a scrap. And I found these pieces of the purple cardstock that were pretty similar also as scraps. And so I was and here's another example of that. Like I have these little scraps and then these purple little scraps, which are almost perfectly the right size. So I was like, well, I guess we're using them together. And that's where I start my card. I'm going to start with my scraps always. And as I'm working through these paper pads, because I'm trying to use the whole paper pad. And if I don't start a card with scraps, I'm going to wind up with just scraps at the end. I will show you a scrap card today. And I do usually try to show you a scrap card so that you can see that you don't have to have big pieces. But even that last card, like that was pretty much a scrap card because I was saying I'm not going to cut into one of my pieces of paper. I'm really just going to use these cut apart elements. So this paper pad had 6 designs. And one of the designs were cut apart. So like there was, the frames and there's a car and a house, etc. And, or a door, not really a house, like a front door scene. And I cut those apart and I have 4 of each because there's 4 of each paper. And that allows me to have like main focal point images for my cards, and I'm going to often use those. The sentiment set that I chose did have a lot of Christmas specific sentiments and then some not so much. If you were trying to lean towards these being winter cards, I probably would say to pick a different stamp set. But if you like the idea of being able to make a lot of holiday cards fast, I really can't recommend those stamp sets from this one from LDRS or the ones from Tailored Expressions that cut a whole bunch of sentiments so fast. Because when you're doing all the time of die cutting all these layers to make one thing simple, like all the banners and sentiments that you need, can really help bring some joy back to the card making. Okay, so here I assembled this card wrong. I had decided that I was going to put it down there in the bottom right by the sentiment. And then when I went to assemble the card later, I forgot what I did and I put it in the center. So if you're going to use the method that I recommend where you put everything in bags, I would suggest one of two things. Probably, I would say take a picture of the card with your cell phone. Because then, with you don't have to glue everything down. You just kind of have it sitting there, like this is how I'm going to glue it down. Take a picture with your cell phone, or assemble one of the cards, so that way you have a reference point, even if you don't have access to your phone or whatever. There were a couple of papers in this collection that had really clear scenes on them. Like here are these little like market stalls for a Christmas market, which I think are really cute, but it's kind of limiting as you put it, as you assemble a card. You want to, like if you're covering, you can certainly cover a little bit of the market stalls, but you want to strategically cut it. And what's nice is it is a double-sided pad, and you'll have heard me say this a million times if you watch my videos. I love double-sided pads. I almost always recommend, if you're going to work with the 6x6 pad, to choose a double-sided, because if there is a pattern like this that's just not your thing and it's really strong, you can flip it over. The sentiment I'm going to put on a piece of pattern paper and then onto a mat, but I had scraps of different colors, so I decided that the mat around the sentiment, I would just let it be different colors, instead of, trying to find or cut up a new piece to make them all the same color. And in general, I think that was a really helpful choice because it helped me to use the cardstock scraps as well. I didn't have to feel like I had to cut into a new piece every time. So here's the example of the cut aparts, like the houses, the frames, the wooden door, etc. And I like to kind of, as I'm working, stop and evaluate like what is still left so that I don't lose track of some things, and then towards the end find out that I have like a bunch of little things to work with, or that this one thing that I really liked somehow got lost on my desk and I, didn't get to use it the way I wanted to. I really liked the idea of using this really bold wood with the really bold wood cut apart. And the other side had these like cozy cabins. What was nice is I was able to cut off a chunk of the wood paper and the cut apart such that I could get the mats for both of them out of the same piece of the scrapbook.com cardstock. I just had to, be really careful as I cut, because that was the other thing about using these pieces of cardstock that were kind of limited in size rather than having a big old piece, is if I made a decision to use one. I was making 4 of each card. I've said that a billion times, but there are 5 of each piece of cardstock. So if I mess up one, I'll be okay. But in general, I need to be really careful that I cut things precisely, because if I'm trying to get the mats for 2 things out of one piece of cardstock and I cut it wrong, then I'm not going to have enough left and there's not going to be a bunch of extra to use. So another reason, maybe if you don't like the finickiness of trying to be like really, really precise. And honestly, I didn't. Like I was a little bit sometimes like stressed out by it, and like always like double checking my measurements and going really slowly so that I didn't mess up. Then this paper pad might not be, like this cardstock pad might not be for you. You might be better served with an 8.5 by 11 cardstock. And I do think that there are going to be some times in the future where I choose to purchase a cardstock pack that coordinates with my paper collection if I'm going to be doing some matting, for example. Okay, so I think this is another time where I'm going back and forth and I'm not sure about how I want to do things. One of the things that I kind of liked about the paper pad, it was a challenge, but ultimately I think this is another one where I don't actually glue it down the right way in the end. I make the design different. I'm sorry, guys. Yeah. Well, you'll see two choices. This is choice 1 for how to glue it down and complete the card. And then when I finish the card, in my blog post, you'll see that it's a different card, a different arrangement of the same elements. All the measurements will be the same, but I kind of like this one better, and I'm bummed that I forgot how I assembled it. So I'm going to take my own advice next time and take pictures of all of these, because I didn't. And then when I was assembling them later, I forgot some of the designs. And I know people have asked me that. They're like, oh, do you like, what do you do so that you don't forget? And I was like, I don't know. And it's a good thing I have an answer now. Like, it's going to be, I took a picture because I don't want to keep messing up like this for you guys. Anyway, I took some of these die cuts that I said earlier that the cozy cabins were on the back of that darker piece of wood cards or wood pattern paper. They're not. It's this one. This one has a different wood background. That's why I was confused them as well. And sorry that I've apparently made about 20 so mistakes so far in this video. Anyway, so the cardstock pack, a challenge that in some ways I liked in the end, but was certainly a challenge, is that the colors of the cardstock pack mostly went with the pattern paper. There were a lot of great choices. There's a lot of blue in the pattern paper and a lot of blue in the cardstock pack, but then there were a few that were maybe a little bit more challenging. Like, for instance, this purple. I think the purples go well with the paper pad, but they don't necessarily go really well with every single sheet of the paper pad. Like, there's some that clearly don't have any purple in them, and I don't know that the purple really like brings out anything in them. But then there were others like this wood grain or green that go really well with purple, and that's fine. So I liked the challenge of being bold with my color choices. It's really easy to just make everything match. And I did mention earlier, like, something that I'd hesitate with about cardstock is that there may not be a perfect match. But this was a good example for me of, like, it doesn't have to be a perfect match. That it actually can still look good and sometimes look better because you got to make a bold choice about what the, colors that you're going to use are. I found that because I was making so many cards, I was actually running out of the cardstock from the paper pad. I did have like scrap bits left, but I didn't have any larger bits. And so I did pull in some gray. And the last time I used a P13 pad, I used gray and craft. And I think if you like to use neutrals for your cardstock mats, that gray and craft would work well for this collection, but I think gray would probably be my favorite. Black might also be like an interesting bold choice to go with it and really make some of these subtler papers and patterns pop against the black. So this is a thought process there, but I did wind up incorporating some pieces of gray cardstock. I buy most of my cardstock except white I do get random pieces here and there and things, but I buy a majority, let's say, of my cardstock at Michael's. The Recollections 110 pound It's good enough quality, particularly for matting, and I used it for card bases for years and also found it to be really good quality. I did recently switch over to Accent Opaque for my card bases and my white cardstock in general because I felt like I liked that I could get it delivered to my door basically because it's from Amazon and I don't have to go to the store to get some because as someone who makes 44 cards regularly, I run out of cardstock pretty fast. And so having them subscribe and just deliver it to me regularly and not having to run out to the store to get more is pretty awesome. I realized I could just like buy a bunch of packs at Michael's at one time, but then you have to, store all those packs somewhere. And I don't really have a super giant craft space. So, okay. I also was finding that with these cut aparts, I wanted to start layering them to use them more. So like there's a piece of green paper underneath the car cut apart. The other side of that is a cut apart. It's like a frame, but I'm running out of cards to even use them on. And they're so small, I want to do some things to make them feel a little bit more substantial. They're not all this small, but there are a few that are. And so layering them together and then putting some cardstock around that arrangement helped them to become a bit more prominent and helped me to use a few at a time. I also was getting to the point because I was running like low on the cardstock that I several times chose to like the mat that I used for the background of a card. Each one of the 4 cards might have a different color because as I mentioned before, there are 5 of each sheet. So if I used 4 of the dark green on another card, I have 1 dark green sheet left and then 1 dark purple and then 1 of the teal blue or whatever. So I took the 1 of each and I made a new set of 4. I also was finding that I was getting to the point that I had a lot of scraps of pattern paper left, which didn't really surprise me because again, there are only 6 designs. And once you take the cut aparts out, that's only 5 designs. And then I have to design 11 cards. You certainly can't be using a giant chunk of pattern paper on every single one because if you were, which would be fine, you can make less cards and there's nothing wrong with that either. You would get about 5 designs and then you'd be working with just scraps. So more often than not, I did have a lot of pattern paper or, not scraps. It's like it's, a 2 by 6 inch piece or something, but it's still, not enough to cover a card. And therefore, I was finding that I was wanting to use some of my pieces of cardstock to kind of supplement as well and make more of a design element. In particular, I noticed that if you take one of the sheets of the cardstock from the paper pad or the cardstock pad and you cut it into 4s, it makes a pretty decent sized focal point. It should be about 5.5. So like 2 by 2.75. And so, that is enough to draw the eye and arrange some of those die cuts from the front and back of the paper pad. And I did that often for my focal points as I pulled in some of those die cuts when I ran out of the cut aparts. Okay, so here is my well and true scrap card. I just needed a piece of cardstock to tape these all to. So what I did was I took the back and front of the scrapbook.com cardstock pack. I cut them in half and then that created 4 pieces. And I'm going to just glue a whole bunch of my stripes of pattern paper and cardstock scraps to it and then trim off the edges. So you'll kind of see as I work through that. Now, I'm realizing just now that I'm getting towards the end of the video, but I'm missing some video footage. I do show you all the cards, but at the end, I also go back and I take some designs that I previously created and I add some of the extra die cuts. So when I get to the end, I have some die cuts left, like little jingle bells and floral things and pine cones. And I go through and I add them to the fronts of some of the cards where I thought, oh, this could use a little something extra. Also, I add them to the inside of cards. So I do have scraps left. And I'm making this scrap card with all the stripes here, but even still I have scraps left. I have scraps of cardstock, I have scraps of pattern paper, and I have die cuts that haven't been used for anything. I'm not going to save those for a different day, and you'll know this if you've seen my other 6x6 paper pad tours. I'm going to get rid of them right away. And so I, just take out my Barely Arts liquid glue because it's super fast. And I just start putting glue on scraps and popping them inside cards in little arrangements, or adding a little die cut bell here and there to the sentiment or the focal image. Just like I was like, if I chose, for instance, this bell image, but I have a piece of foliage also left over, I'll tuck the foliage behind the bell or something like that to finish them off. So here you can see I have that piece of cardstock completely covered in all the little strips. I'm going to trim off the edges. If you ever wind up with strips, like this is like one of the easiest, most and it's kind of fun to arrange all these different little elements. I am going to create a gray cardstock mat for it. And there I'm just taking the measurement of what it is so that I know, what I want to trim the mat to. And then I will also, since when I looked at the sort of finished scrap panel there, I thought the purple was like the most clear place to put a sentiment, and therefore I am going to put the sentiment there and then arrange a little die cut around it to kind of draw a bit more attention to it and to use up some of the die cuts. So here I picked out like 4 different die cuts because I know I'm going to make 4 of this card. And I often will do that. I've only created the one card, but then I pick all the different embellishments that I'm going to use for all 4 of them at the same time. Okay, that's it for my card video today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I will leave you links to the products I used in the video description below. I would love for you to leave me a comment, maybe mention which card was your favorite, or I don't know, anything. If you want to have a question, I do read all my comments. I will respond to many of them, and I will respond to any questions that you ask me. And I really thank you for taking this time to spend with me today. I know these videos aren't short, but I really hope that you get something out of them and you enjoy hearing some tips and tricks from a fellow crafter. Thank you so much. Have an awesome day.